Welcome back to the shop, my friends. Steve here at SKS Props. This is part 2 of my Wolverine chest armor build series. If you haven't checked part 1 out yet, be sure to go do that, because in that video, I went over all the steps that it takes to fabricate the armor to get it to this point. In this part 2 video, we're going to be painting and weathering. Of course, my favorite things, because paint makes the prop and it's what brings it to life. Now, you also know me, I love my layers when it comes to paint, and this chest armor definitely has a bunch of layers to it, and that's because yellow. Yellow is always a difficult color to paint because it's not very opaque and it's usually not all that vibrant. But I think I did a great job in this particular video trying to make those colors pop. I also love the difference in sheen that we have going on here. So we have a matte in the chest, metallics in the shoulders, very reminiscent to X-Men of the olden days, and that's definitely what I was going for. So I want to show you what it takes to paint this chest armor up. Let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start the painting process by sealing all of the foam armor with 2 light coats of black Plasti-Dip. A single coat of gray will be applied on top of this to help lighten it up. And here you can see the difference between that final gray coat and just the black. Now I'm going to do a dusting of Krylon Primer Oxide Red on just the chest, not the shoulder pads. This is going to give me a decent base to start to apply some Krylon Flat Yellow. The shoulder pads will receive a dusting of navy blue. And when I say a dusting, you can see here that I'm not completely covering up the underlying colors. This will make the colors on top richer. To block in the blue areas, I'm going to do a mixture of cobalt blue and brilliant blue, along with some Payne's gray and cadmium red. All these colors mixed together will give us a base blue that's not too vibrant, which is exactly what I want so I can add highlight layers on top. I want to make sure not to get any of this blue on the yellow sections because it's very hard to cover up. So I'm taking my time and I'm using small to medium-sized filbert brushes. And again, notice that I'm not completely covering the yellow that's underneath. These variations in the layers of paint is what tricks the eye and makes everything look more believable. Especially when we're dealing with a battle-worn piece like this that's going to have a lot of paint chippage and battle damage. The shoulder pads get a wash of this blue tint applied to them as well. Using some Liquitex Heavy Body Mars Black, I can now start to block in the black sections on this armor as well. And here you can see I even made a mistake. The lower section of the belt should have been black, not blue. But in this stage of the game, it's an easy fix. I'll also go through and I'll put some small marks on the sections that need to be black just so I don't make a mistake. Now, yellow is a very difficult color for coverage. That's why I'm using some cadmium yellow and some yellow oxide as well as some raw sienna. The raw sienna being added into here is important because it's more opaque and will help with coverage. At this stage, I don't want to add any water. This is purely dry brushing using a 1-inch mop brush. And that's because if I add too much water to this, it will flow down into all those detailed recesses. I also start to use some masking tape on sections that I've already painted because I don't want to get any paint onto these surfaces. Plus, it definitely helps to make certain parts of the yellow act as a highlight. The other thing to take into consideration when painting sections that have a lot of the same color is to usually work from the outside in. This is going to help define each individual section of the armor, especially at a distance. And this is still dry brushing with just the pigment, no additional water. I highlight the details on the sides using that same masking method. This is another mixture of the yellow paints, this time without the raw sienna. While these two paints together aren't as opaque, they are more vibrant, so this is really where I start choosing sections of the armor to highlight. Whether it's the front or the back, I'm still using that method of highlighting the outermost section and then feathering it into the middle. With enough time and practice, you can achieve smooth textures like this without ever using an airbrush. Now once everything was pretty smooth, I decided I wanted certain areas to be a little more splotchy. The paint is applied with a higher concentration of the pigments just stippled on. And visually, I'm just selecting areas that I think are going to look more interesting. Using masking tape, I section off the lower portion of the shoulder pads. That's because I'm going to use the same red oxide and yellow that I'd used on the chest. This is going to lighten it up enough that I can apply the same yellow layers to this section by hand. And again, I don't want this completely smooth, so I'm adding in some variations. I'm going to be using Liquitex Heavy Body Cobalt Blue for the highlight layer of all the blue armor sections. And when using a cobalt like this, definitely be careful around the yellows, because once you get it on there, it is not coming off and you're going to have to repaint over it. This includes adding cobalt to the detail lines on the front of the chest and the back armor. Just like the yellow, I don't want this completely uniform. I want some variation in it. That way it's just not going to appear as a solid blue, especially since this armor is supposed to be a little bit dirty. The cobalt blue can be applied to the shoulder pads as well, but the texture I'm applying to these is a little bit different because these are eventually going to look metallic. So when using the mop brushes, I'm applying more of a stippling technique than just dry brushing. So I'm looking at the armor, and at this point I decide I want to replace all of the fake foam rivets with actual pop rivets. I start by knocking the nail out of the rivet itself. Then being very careful, I can remove all the fake rivets with some tweezers. Then drilling out just enough material, I can add a little bit of adhesive and then push the pop rivets into the foam. Just like the shoulder pads being metallic will set them apart from the rest of the armor, these little tiny pop rivets have that metallic hint to them, and from a distance they really stand out. Now this is time consuming and there are quite a few of them, but I think it's worth it in the end. The only problem I had is the lower back armor. That's where one of the parachute clips is installed. So I had to cut a portion of the pop rivet stem off, that way it could sit flush with the armor. And if you didn't want to add the pop rivets to your chest armor, that's not a big deal. With the blue and yellow sections wrapped up, I can now go back and add a second coat of the black. I decided I didn't want as much variation on these as I had put on the other colors. I could also touch up any of the straps or parachute clips that got a little bit of overspray. For all the battle damage areas, I switch over to a liner brush and smaller detail brushes. That way I can get down into the crevices without ruining any of the yellow paint. The X that's on the front of his belt is going to be painted using some cadmium red with a little bit of Mars black, just to tone it down. This is also carefully painted on with a detail brush because cadmiums are very opaque. Some Liquitex Payne's Gray is going to be applied to the trim sections on the shoulder pads that I'm going to paint metallic. This will give these parts the same underlying base color, and then I can paint on some Liquitex Iridescent Rich Silver on top using a detail brush. I apply the paint in a couple of layers just to help build it up because I want it to have that same metallic look as the rivets that I added earlier. I decided I wanted my shoulder pads to look like 90s style Wolverine from the comic books and the series, which means I need to apply a metallic blue as a top layer. Lucky for me, I still have some FX Saber Blue laying around. Now this FX paint is very thin, which can be a good and a bad thing. In this case, it's a good thing because it's not going to cover all the detail layers that I've already put into the shoulder pads. While the cobalt is still the main color, the FX blue shines when light hits it just right. And just like the yellow, I'm highlighting the outside edge and working my way in. But it presents a really cool reflection, especially looking at the metallics above and below and the matte yellow. And since these are supposed to be metal shoulder pads, I want to add some paint chipping to the battle damaged areas and along the edge. This can be achieved by adding some more Liquitex Iridescent Rich Silver with the side of a filbert brush. Just like adding too much battle damage, this is a technique you could easily overdo, so just pick a couple of areas that will be visually interesting.
So you all can see the steps that it takes to paint Wolverine's chest armor from the upcoming Deadpool and Wolverine. But don't just think of this video series as just Wolverine's armor. Change some of these details, change the color scheme. You could utilize this template for a bunch of different superheroes, and I hope you do. And if you are making any of my builds like this, be sure to tag me at SKS Props on Twitter and Instagram because I love seeing your creations. Until next time, build your best with the best. HD Foam.